Back when I was 20, during the summer before my senior year of college, I ended up getting an internship at a financial services firm downtown. It wasn't anything glamorous, mostly data entry, spreadsheets, and sitting in front of a computer all day, but the pay was decent and it looked great on a resume. There were 7 other interns besides me, and we were all squeezed together in this big open office with rows of cubicles that didn't really offer privacy, just enough to make small talk optional. Out of the 7, 5 of them were people I genuinely liked, a bunch of easygoing, down-to-earth college students who didn't treat the internship too seriously. Another guy, Eric, acted like the whole thing was a life-or-death situation, barely talked to anyone, and typed like his keyboard had personally wronged him. But the 7th intern, Alex, was on a completely different level. When I first met Alex, he seemed normal enough, maybe a bit awkward, but we all were in the beginning. He was tall, skinny, kind of pale, with a mop of dark hair that always looked slightly unwashed. He didn't really fit the typical finance intern mold. But that wasn't what threw me off. It was the way he acted around me specifically. At first, it was subtle. He'd show up at my cubicle during the day and lean over the divider in this unnatural way that made him look freakishly tall, like 7 feet, since the cubicle walls were low and only his head would hover above them. He'd tilt his head a little, grin with this weird frozen smile, and start talking in a deliberately creepy voice, like he was trying way too hard to freak me out. I'd laugh awkwardly, pretending I thought it was funny, but it always struck me as incredibly out of place in a professional environment. He'd say stuff like, working hard or hardly working, Ronnie, in that slow, unnatural tone and hold the smile way too long. The first couple of times, I figured he was just quirky or trying a little too hard to stand out. Some interns are like that, so I didn't want to make it a big thing. But then he started doing it constantly. Every day, at least once, I'd see his head rising slowly above the cubicle wall, that same stretched grin on his annoying face, and he'd launch into some bizarre conversation that made no sense. Sometimes he'd crack jokes that weren't jokes or mutter random phrases unrelated to anything. And every time he used that unsettling soft, taunting voice. Honestly, the best recent comparison I can make is the voice Charlie Hunnam used when playing Ed Gein. The other interns noticed it too, but they mostly brushed it off, thinking he was just being intentionally weird to lighten the atmosphere. I think they also assumed he and I had some kind of rapport they didn't have with him. But something about the fact he only did it to me made me uneasy. It wasn't like I treated him differently. It was like I had somehow become his personal audience for whatever creepy act he was performing. As the weeks passed, his visits got longer. He'd lean there for minutes, staring while talking, sometimes barely saying anything, just watching me. I'd fake a laugh, tell him I had a report to finish, and hope he'd take the hint. He almost never did. Then one night, about 6 weeks into the internship, I was at home eating dinner when my phone rang. It was a number I didn't know. Normally I ignore unknown calls, but I was expecting a delivery confirmation, so I answered. When I said hello, there was silence for a few seconds. Then a voice I recognized immediately. It was Alex's voice, the same forced creepy tone he always used at the office. He said, "The tide's coming in. Pull your boat out of the water," but this time he practically shouted it, drawing the words out like part of some riddle. Then he broke into this completely unhinged, manic laughter and hung up. What made my skin crawl wasn't just the call, it was that I had never once given Alex my number. The first thing I did was text the number asking if it was him, but the message wouldn't send. When I looked it up, it turned out to be a landline. That's when the fear really kicked in. How did he get my number? Why call me like that? I tried to come up with rational explanations, maybe he found it on some company contact list, but even then, the way he said that line stuck with me. I couldn't stop replaying his laugh in my head. It didn't sound like someone joking. It sounded like someone genuinely trying to unsettle me. This wasn't goofy behavior anymore. When I arrived at the office Monday morning, Alex wasn't there. His desk was empty and I didn't see him at all. I went to our supervisor, Martin, and asked if Alex might have gotten my number through the company somehow, and Martin looked confused and said interns didn't have access to employee info. On top of that, they had let Alex go at the end of the previous week because he wasn't doing any work and had ignored multiple warnings. That's when I told him about the call. He looked surprised, and a couple of interns overheard and nodded, saying they'd always thought Alex was creepy and that he made them uncomfortable too. I told them everything, about the cubicle visits, the voice, all of it. Martin told me not to worry since Alex was gone for good and had no reason to come back. That eased my mind a little. For the next week or so, I kept expecting something else, a message, some random encounter, but nothing happened. Work went back to normal. I assumed maybe it really was over until one early morning. It was Friday around 5 a.m., still dark except for a thin gray light seeping through the blinds. I woke because I thought I'd heard something, maybe from outside, and got up to check the window. I wish I hadn't. Standing in my backyard, halfway between the trees and the porch light, was someone staring up at my window. Even with the faint light, I knew immediately who it was. The thin frame, the messy hair, the rigid posture, it was Alex. For a moment I was frozen. I just stared, trying to process what I was seeing. Then, in that same creepy sing-song voice he always used at work, he called out my name, dragging it out like before. I grabbed my phone, ready to call 911, when he tilted his head back and started laughing, that same loud, hysterical, deranged laugh from the phone. It didn't sound right. It sounded like someone completely detached from reality. I shouted that I was calling the police and to get off my property, waving my phone at him. He just stood there a moment longer, then turned and walked away, still laughing as he disappeared into the trees. I called the police, and the dispatcher asked if he was still there. When I said no, she told me to call back if he returned or tried to break in. I never saw him again. Not at work, not anywhere in town. The police couldn't do much since he hadn't threatened me or broken in. It was one of those situations where you're stuck living with the unease, hoping it's done. The rest of the summer went by without anything else happening. I finished the internship, and on the last day, my boss offered me a permanent position after graduation. I accepted at the time, though part of me was uncomfortable about ever going back. I never told them what happened that morning, there didn't seem to be a point. Alex was gone, and no one knew where he'd ended up. Eventually I convinced myself he must have been dealing with some sort of mental illness or social disorder, something that explained how he went from a quiet, awkward intern to standing in my backyard at 5 a.m., laughing like a maniac. It's been years now and I've moved on. I didn't take the job there. I got a different one after graduating. I don't think about it much anymore, but sometimes that image of him in my yard still creeps me out. I still wonder how he got my number, how he found my address, and what he wanted that morning. I guess it isn't hard to get someone's info online these days. All I know is that for a few months, I worked beside someone who wasn't just strange, there was something much deeper going on. And no matter how many years pass, I'll never forget the sound of him laughing in the dark, like it was all one big joke only he understood. I was 17 when all of this happened. It was my first real job, working at a local grocery store in our quiet little town in Vermont, the kind of place where everybody knows everyone else, and nothing out of the ordinary ever really goes on. At first, I actually liked the job. It was simple, and most of my coworkers were friendly enough. I quickly got into a routine with the cashiers and a few of the stock guys, especially during slower hours when hardly any customers came through. During those times, we'd all gather near the front of the store, chatting about random TV shows, making jokes about some of the older, quirkier employees, and complaining about customers the way coworkers usually do. It was one of the rare moments in a shift when I felt like I wasn't just stuck behind a register staring at the screen or a blank wall. Depending on which supervisor was in charge that day, things were either relaxed or more strict. If it was one of the younger ones, the vibe was chill, people would be on their phones, and everyone would hang around near the front. There was one coworker I didn't really know at all at first, a guy named Sean. He was 24, a little awkward, the sort of person who never seemed to fully understand social cues. His hair was kind of long but stuck in that in-between stage, like he was growing it out but hadn't gotten it to shoulder length yet. He worked in the dairy department, so I barely interacted with him. He was quiet and polite enough, and I honestly didn't think anything of him. Most people just nodded at him when passing by, and he did the same. Eventually I was added to a group chat for employees, and he happened to be in it. I didn't think twice about it, it was just a place for dumb jokes and work updates, and most of the younger workers were in there. But then Sean started messaging me directly. At first it was harmless, questions about shifts, asking if I was covering certain days, small work-related stuff. But over the next few weeks it became really clear he was trying to get closer. He started asking about my personal interests, what music I listened to, what I did after work, even little things about my weekends. I brushed it off at first since small talk isn't unusual, but something about the tone felt off. Sometimes he'd call me cute in ways that made me uncomfortable. Sometimes there'd be flirty comments slipped into otherwise normal messages. I tried to ignore it, thinking he just didn't know how to act around girls my age. And that's the thing, I was 17. He was significantly older than me, and I don't think anyone else realized he was flirting with me at all. Soon his behavior turned more irritating. He'd comment on things I posted online, sending messages late at night. Not threatening, not exactly, but persistent in a way that made my stomach twist. I didn't want things to get awkward at work, so I mostly ignored him. Everyone always says don't mess where you eat, right? One day I was at home watching Stranger Things, my favorite show to this day, and I was binge-watching the latest season in my room, completely absorbed in it. Then a few days later at work, a bunch of us were standing near the front talking about TV shows. I was chatting with a couple of cashiers about some random series when Sean suddenly asked, "You like Stranger Things, right?" I froze. I didn't remember ever mentioning that show to anyone at work. I nodded, pretending it didn't mean anything, but a cold feeling spread through me. How did he know? He just smiled that awkward smile and eventually headed back to the dairy section, but I couldn't ignore the sinking realization that he might have been watching me far more than I realized. It wasn't until a few nights later that the actual fear set in. I was lying in bed trying to fall asleep after a long shift when I heard a soft scraping against my bedroom window. At first I assumed it was the wind or a branch, but then I heard it again, a distinct tapping on the glass, soft but deliberate. I got up and peeked through the blinds, half expecting to see Sean standing there, but there was nothing. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, but his weirdly specific question at work about a show I'd never mentioned kept replaying in my mind. A couple days later he texted me again, and this time I didn't ignore it. I told him clearly I wasn't interested. That was when everything escalated. Almost instantly he replied, "Okay, good luck changing your address." I was stunned. In one bizarre message, one he clearly sent without thinking, he confirmed exactly what I'd been afraid of. I saved everything and took screenshots. Then I went straight to my manager and explained the entire situation. He was shocked and told me they'd handle it. My dad and I also went to the police station to file a report with the screenshots and explain the tapping at my window and why I suspected Sean was stalking me. The next day at work, Sean was called into the office. He never came back. He was fired immediately and the police started the process for a restraining order. I thought that would be the end, but I learned quickly that nothing feels over when you're afraid someone unstable might come back. Even with the restraining order, if he really was unhinged, what was a piece of paper going to do? I checked locks constantly, refused to answer calls from unknown numbers, and avoided telling anyone outside my family about my routines. The weeks dragged on like that. I'd wake up at night convinced I heard something outside. I kept reminding myself the restraining order was legally binding, that he couldn't come near me. But the fear never really went away. Eventually, after weeks turned to months, the paranoia slowly faded. There were no more incidents, no messages, no appearances, nothing. Life gradually returned to normal. I started feeling safe walking alone again and stopped checking the window before bed. Eventually I stopped thinking about Sean altogether. It took a long time to feel fully safe, longer than I expected. Even after moving on, the experience left a lasting mark. I became hyper-aware of my surroundings, more cautious about meeting new people, especially in situations where I felt isolated. I learned to trust my instincts and take any uncomfortable behavior seriously, even if it seems small at first. Looking back, the thing that scares me most isn't that Sean might have physically hurt me. It's how someone who seems mildly awkward or harmless can so quickly turn into someone you're genuinely afraid of. It starts with little comments, small interactions, seemingly innocent messages, and suddenly it becomes something far more serious. Now, years later, I've moved past it. I live in a new apartment, work in a different town, and I don't talk to anyone from that grocery store anymore. But the memory of lying in bed at night convinced someone was outside my window, that's something that never fully disappears. It's a reminder of how fast life can shift from safe to terrifying, even in a small, quiet town where nothing ever seems to happen. And while Sean never physically harmed me, the psychological impact was enough to make me question how safe I ever truly was. So if you ever notice a coworker crossing a line, even in subtle ways, take it seriously. Don't chalk it up to awkwardness or harmless flirting. It might feel dramatic, but it could save you from months of fear, or worse, because sometimes the danger isn't obvious. But eventually, I did move on. And now, years later, I can look back and say I made it through. And that's enough. When I was 26, I got hired at a small insurance office tucked behind a strip mall in a quiet part of Pennsylvania, a place with a single row of desks, buzzing fluorescent lights that never stopped flickering, and a constant smell of old coffee lingering in the air. It wasn't an exciting job, but it paid my bills, and most of the people who worked there were decent enough. The work could get monotonous, especially on slow days when the phones barely rang, but it was easy money. I normally worked the daytime shift, but on this particular Friday, I was scheduled to help close because we were behind on filing a batch of client paperwork. That afternoon came with a big storm warning, the kind the local news wouldn't stop talking about. The moment I woke up and looked outside, the sky was already dark, and I could tell the day was going to be drenched. By around 3 p.m., the rain was falling so hard you couldn't even see the end of the road. Thunder soon followed, rattling the windows every few minutes. Honestly, I didn't mind the storm, the atmosphere was kind of soothing. The manager decided to send most employees home early before the weather got too dangerous, but a few of us volunteered to stay and finish up. The only other person who stayed was a guy named Tom who had started working there about 2 weeks earlier. He was in his early 30s, tall, quiet, and just unsettling enough that I couldn't explain why. Not outright creepy, just odd. He rarely talked to anyone, but he always seemed to show up near me. If I went to make coffee, he'd appear moments later. If I restocked paper, he'd wander over pretending he needed supplies too. I assumed he was just awkward socially. By the time 5 p.m. rolled around, the storm was raging. Lightning flashed every few seconds, followed by thunder that made the floor vibrate. The office felt emptier than usual, and the usual background noise of lights and electronics had been replaced entirely by the storm. Tom sat a few desks away, typing something on his screen that looked like gibberish from where I sat. Every time I glanced up, I caught him glancing at me. I tried to stay focused on my work, but after about an hour, I realized he hadn't moved once. Around 6:30, the lights started flickering. We both made the same nervous little laugh when they dimmed, though he didn't say a word. The next flicker lasted longer, and then the power completely cut out, plunging the building into silence except for the rain pounding outside. The emergency lights switched on, covering everything in a dim orange glow. I said something about maybe heading home, but Tom didn't respond. I heard keys jingling and then the sound of the front door locking. He muttered something about how it wasn't safe to go out right now. I thought he was trying to be cautious, but something about his tone made my stomach twist. I went to grab my jacket and bag, figuring I'd wait a bit until the storm lightened up. The outage made the whole office feel much smaller, the hallways dim, and the storm outside impossibly loud. When I returned to the front, Tom was standing at the door staring into the dark parking lot. The rain was so heavy you couldn't see anything past the glass. I told him I was going to call my boyfriend to let him know I'd be late. He didn't answer, he just kept staring outside. I walked to the break room, but when I tried my phone, it had no signal. I figured the storm had knocked out the tower. I tried the office landline, but it was dead too. When I turned to go back, I nearly screamed. Tom was standing in the doorway, and I hadn't heard him approach. He held a small flashlight under his chin, casting eerie shadows over his face, wearing a half-smile like he thought it was some kind of joke. I forced a nervous laugh, telling him he startled me. I asked him again to unlock the door, but he insisted it wasn't safe and that we needed to wait until the storm passed. I agreed, pretending to stay calm even though a knot of anxiety had formed in my chest. I walked to my cubicle to pack up my things slowly, hoping for a quiet moment to slip out. When I looked up again, Tom was gone. I assumed he went to the bathroom. I took the opportunity to head to the back exit since my car was parked behind the building. When I reached the door, I realized the handle wouldn't budge. Someone had wrapped a chain and padlock around it from the inside. We had never done that before. I turned around and saw a faint glow from his flashlight moving down the hall. I slipped into the supply closet and closed the door softly, trying not to breathe too loudly. I heard Tom's footsteps, slow and deliberate. Then he called my name in a voice that sounded weirdly gentle, saying he just wanted to make sure I was safe. I didn't answer. My heart pounded so hard I felt sure he could hear it. He walked past the closet and for a moment I saw a thin strip of light shining under the door, then it vanished. A loud crack of thunder shook the building and the rain intensified for a moment. I realized water must have been leaking from the roof above the break room. I waited what felt like 10 minutes before gathering the courage to open the closet door a crack. The hallway was empty. The flashlight beam was gone. I crept toward the front. When I rounded the corner, I stopped dead in my tracks. The front glass door had been smashed completely. Rain was blowing inside, soaking the carpet. Tom was nowhere to be seen. I hesitated, wondering if he had gone outside, but I knew this was my only chance. I ran through the shattered doorway into the downpour and sprinted for my car. I didn't care how drenched I was. My hands were shaking so badly I could hardly get the key into the ignition. I peeled out of the parking lot without looking back. When I got home, I locked every door and sat awake listening to the storm hit the windows. I didn't sleep at all. The next morning, I called my manager and told him everything. He didn't believe it at first, until he arrived and saw the broken glass for himself. The police came, took my statement, and said they'd investigate, but it looked like Tom had vanished. His car was still in the lot, unlocked, with the keys on the seat. His phone, wallet, and a few of his belongings were still there. The security cameras had been turned off manually before the outage, which meant he had done it earlier. No one ever saw him again. Some coworkers said maybe he had a breakdown, but I kept thinking about how deliberate everything had felt. I quit a month later. Even though nothing else happened, I couldn't work in that small building after what I'd experienced. It just wasn't healthy.